for example, in Romans 8:11, he says, the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. So certainly referring to bodily resurrection there.
People believe that Jesus is alive. Muslims believe that Jesus is alive. But the belief that someone is alive and in heaven with God does not necessitate his bodily resurrection. In the Gospels themselves, you have it that Jesus proclaims that Abraham and Moses are alive. They're alive with God. But the belief that they're alive does not necessitate their bodily resurrection. So it is quite possible that the disciples of Jesus, witnessing the crucifixion event, later on came to the conclusion, for whatever reason, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And that conclusion does not necessitate finding his tomb empty and knowing that he physically, bodily resurrected from the dead. It is just a faith expression of the closeness that Jesus had with God and the conviction of his disciples that God did not leave Jesus alone to suffer in this horrible way.
I think I'd have to take issue with that, because when we go back to the earliest tradition, like, for example, the creeds, there's several of them peppered throughout the New Testament, but let's just, we talked about 1 Corinthians 15, that he died, and that he was raised, and that he appeared. In Romans chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, and the majority of scholars acknowledge that we have an actual early formula or oral tradition there. It says that he was declared the Son of God with power by the Spirit of holiness through his resurrection from the dead. So in the various early traditions, in fact, that would predate Paul, that predates everything, those references. There are, I counted, 3 creeds themselves within the New Testament that would predate Paul and go back to within just a few years. In fact, James D.G. Dunn says that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 dates to within months of the crucifixion. So we have very early, and goes back to the disciples. Paul himself mentions resurrection or rise from the dead on 30 occasions. So we have a total of 33 references in the New Testament, very early, predating the Gospels, and a number of those predating even Paul, that talks about Jesus being dead and raised, or resurrection. And of course, as I mentioned, the concept of resurrection, the body that was buried is the same body that's raised and was transformed into an immortal body. And the testimony of the disciples is that's the body that appeared to them.
Well, I think you have to be aware that the creeds that you're referring to have been identified by scholars combing the New Testament, looking at the writings of Paul. They look at Romans, as you've mentioned. They look at 1 Corinthians. You didn't mention Philippians, but it's there in the back of your mind as another one of the kerygmas that scholars have identified as early statements of faith. But notice that Paul does not say where he got these from. And Paul, in adding his own adding himself to the list of people to whom Jesus appeared, is adding to that list a person to whom Jesus appeared somehow spiritually. Because in the Acts of the Apostles, where the appearance to Paul is described, it is not a physical bodily appearance, but it is a blind flashing light from out of heaven. So once Paul has added that, I think your case becomes weak here, and it becomes more like the case of those who say that the disciples of Jesus must have seen an appearance of Jesus, and Muslims should be willing to grant that God, in order to solace the companions of Jesus, allowed them to see a spiritual vision of Jesus that would persuade them that Jesus is alive with God, so that they can go forward and preach the Christian faith, despite the fact that Jesus died this horrible death, which would mark him off in the eyes of people as a condemned criminal, a blasphemer, and a false Messiah. So none of the evidence you have cited actually proves that Jesus physically, bodily, rose from the dead.
Okay, I appreciate you saying that. Actually, I don't think that what Paul saw on the road to Damascus was a bodily appearance or a spiritual vision or appearance like you're saying. But I'm glad you grant Acts, because if you want to do that, then we'll go to Acts 13, where Paul is preaching as well. And there he very distinctly and precisely says bodily resurrection. He contrasts King David with Jesus, and he says, David died, was buried, his body decayed. Jesus died, was buried, and his body also, but his body did not decay. Rather, God raised it up, and of that we are all eyewitnesses. So in doing so, he's certainly contrasting what happened to David with Jesus and saying Jesus' body did not decay. He raised it up, and we're eyewitnesses to this. Now, if you mention Paul, we have to also say, even if we do take that appearance in Acts chapters 9, 22, and 26, where he sees him on the road to Damascus, and it's the bright light, this is a post-ascension appearance. So that could certainly account why the difference. It's the disciples saw him right after he had been raised from the dead, but Paul is seen after he ascended to heaven. And Paul elsewhere in his own writings is very clear about bodily resurrection. For example, in Romans 8:11, he says, the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. So certainly referring to bodily resurrection there. And then you have Colossians 2:9, where it says, in Christ all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. And he's using the present tense, and of course this is after post-ascension. So Paul's view is still that Jesus is in a body. There's numerous references like this. So I would just have to disagree with you that he's referring to a vision or a spirit here. And then in terms of where he got the information from, in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18 and 19, he says that 3 years after his conversion, which would have been about 5 years after the crucifixion, he goes up to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples. And he meets with Peter. He says, I met with Peter, and the Greek word used there is hysteresis, from which we get the English word history. And the word would mean that he went up and he did this historical investigation. He was asking for history of Jesus from Peter. And many scholars believe that this is at the point when Paul received this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 and all this, because he was asking a history of Jesus, and that's where he would have received the information from.